Now, a key thing we need to remember when we think about this question of adoption is that it isn't instantaneous. It's not a case of nobody has something and then everyone has it. What tends to happen over time is we see an S-curve. Early on, a few people adopt the new idea, and then other people say, I rather like that, I think I'll do it too. And the curve accelerates until finally there's just a few people at the end who are very slow to take things on. And whether we're talking about toothbrushes or television sets or anything you like, we can see this S-curve of diffusion. And that's really valuable because if we understood what affects that, particularly the slope as it goes upwards, as it starts to accelerate, then we could influence our journey to scale. So we'd like to understand what affects this S-curve of adoption and diffusion. And fortunately, we have somebody who can help us. A man called Everett Rogers. Now, he was a man with a mission. He spent his entire life trying to understand this question and helpfully writing down his answers. And he studied all sorts of innovations in very different contexts all around the world, but all of which followed this S-curve. And he tried to develop a model to help us understand why that happens, what influences that curve. He looked at things like agricultural innovation, new strains of corn or new breeding methods, right the way from the farm to birth control in Latin America, to the adoption of high-tech products, a whole range of very different new ideas. But what he looked at was their common feature: how do they move to scale? And he developed a model which we can use. And the essence of the model that Everett Rogers developed was a very simple one. He saw innovation diffusion as essentially a process of communication. Imagine, I've got an idea. I'm like a radio mast. Beep, beep, beep. I'm broadcasting my idea to you who might adopt it. And so it's a communication process between me and you. We can play with the channels. Maybe I use a broadband, maybe just a single beam, but we can play with the channels. And we can do some other things. It will clearly be influenced by the environment, the weather conditions, and so on. But essentially, that idea of a communication model is at the heart of Everett Rogers' approach. And what he basically says is we need to understand four things. First of all, the characteristics of the thing itself, the message that's being transmitted. And that's a message which is perceived, taken on board, by an adopter. And essentially, the characteristics are not perceived in the same way by everybody. Some people see things much more quickly or see different things compared to others. So characteristics of the innovation are important. So too, of course, are characteristics of the innovator, the one broadcasting the message. How you see me, and when I'm trying to introduce something new to you, is going to be important. And clearly, really important is for us to understand adopters, because we're not all the same. People differ in their approaches to adoption. And the last piece of Rogers' model was the environment. What sorts of things can promote or restrict adoption? So let's break down Rogers' model a little further. Let's look first of all at the idea of the innovation characteristics, this message that's being communicated. And particularly, how do we perceive that message? And Rogers identifies 5 key factors which we can consider. First of all, how far is the new thing better than what it's going to replace? He calls this relative advantage. And that kind of makes sense. If this thing is no better, why do I want to change? But remember, it's not whether it actually is, it's whether we perceive it as being somehow better. Relative advantage. Second factor has to do with complexity. How far do we perceive whether this thing is complicated? I don't quite understand it, in which case we might be slow to adopt, or whether we say, hey, it's simple. Take a look at advertising next time you're watching TV or reading a magazine, and see how often the message is, it's so simple, it's child's play. Anyone can do it. And that, of course, is trying to get you to shape your perception of the thing in terms of, it's not complex, don't worry. Perhaps one of the famous advocates of this was George Eastman, the man who founded the Kodak company. He took the world of photography, which is complicated and scientific, he took it from the professional studio and brought it into the home, into everyday life. And his model was simple. Here's a camera, the box brownie. You point and click, and we'll do the rest. In other words, it's simple. You too can create photos. So the second key factor, how complex, or how is it perceived as complex or not? A third important factor is observability. Seeing is believing. Now, this was particularly relevant when Rogers looked at farming. Imagine farmer X and farmer Y have fields next to each other, and farmer X adopts a new strain of corn that grows twice as high as farmer Y. It doesn't take long before farmer Y looks across and says, hang on a minute, my neighbor has corn twice as good as mine. What's the difference? Seeing is believing, and that very quickly shapes adoption behavior. So again, if we're wanting to promote the adoption of our innovation, can we make the benefits visible? Think about how detergent is often sold on TV or in magazines. This detergent washes white, but look at this. This detergent washes much whiter. Seeing is believing. The fourth of Rogers' characteristics is called trialability. Now, if you think about it, adopting something new, we're taking a risk. Now, maybe trying a new toothpaste brand isn't a big risk, but certainly buying a new car or something like that is a bit of a big step. It's a big financial commitment. So if you gave us the chance to try before we buy, that might help dispose us in the right direction. We can take a small risk, and if we like it, then we can take the big risk. Trialability. Think about software. How much software these days is sold on what's called a freemium model. Try this out for free. And if you like the features, then pay a little and you can unlock more features. That's classic trialability. And the last of Rogers' 5 characteristics about innovation adoption, about innovation characteristics, is what's called compatibility. And this is the really hard one, because what that's really saying is, how far do we perceive this new thing as fitting in to our world? And that's quite a challenge. Does it fit with our lifestyle? Does it fit with our culture, our beliefs? One of the things he found, for example, with birth control in Latin America, is that whilst that was a very powerful technology, very safe and powerful, it didn't fit well in a culture which was dominated by the Catholic Church and its beliefs about birth control. So this challenge of making sure our innovation fits is something else we should bear in mind. Now, a second important set of characteristics in Rogers' model are those that have to do not with perceptions of the message, but actually perceptions of the one broadcasting the message, what Rogers calls the innovator characteristics. And perhaps the most important principle here is that we trust people who are like us. It's a principle Rogers calls homophily. And what that means in the context of adopting new ideas is we're likely to listen to and take on board new ideas from people we perceive as being like us. And equally, if the idea appears to have come from over there from someone outside our world, we'll be much more resistant to it. And so therefore, if we're trying to accelerate diffusion, what we want to play up is, we understand your world, we're from your world. Think about Brownie Wise in the Tupperware example we saw earlier. Tupperware as a product was a great product. In terms of the innovation characteristics, wonderful. It had relative advantage, it had observability, it had all the things that should tick the box. What made the difference was that Brownie Wise took it from being a product sold by a plastics company, we don't really know that world, and instead it was housewives talking to housewives. The whole social marketing model was essentially one built on listening to an innovation story, will you adopt this product, being told to you by somebody like you. So this principle of homophily, of people like us, and shaping perceptions around that is another key part of innovation diffusion. Now, the third set of factors in Rogers' model have to do with the adopter characteristics. the person on the receiving end of this wonderful message about an innovation they might or might not adopt. What do we know about them? Well, perhaps the most important point is we are not all the same. We are different in our degrees of willingness to try new things out, and that distributes over time approximately in a bell-shaped curve. At one end, at the very early stage, there are people who are interested in new things because they're new. They're just really excited by new things. They'll try anything new out. They're actually seen as a bit on the fringe. We're interested to see people like that, but they're not really like us. The key group of people are the ones who are like us, but do things early. They think, I think I'll put solar panels on my roof, or I'll buy an electric car, or I will adopt an innovation ahead of the rest. And Rogers calls them early adopters. The next part of his model are the early majority, the name speaks for itself, and then the late majority. And finally, at the other end of this curve, we have what Rogers calls the laggards, the ones who are very reluctant to adopt new things, may even not adopt them. But the key point is there's a distribution. And lots of things might affect that. Education, age, all sorts of things. But the main message to take is we need to be clear, people are not all the same. One other key part is Rogers again talks about this idea of homophily. We trust people like us, we're influenced by them. And so here we see the way in which early adopters can become opinion leaders. They're the ones that other people will choose to follow. If we think about Instagram today, the role of the influencer is really important, but they're essentially people like us whose decisions about new things we respect and may shape our behavior. So this is a very important approach. One other thing which we can learn from this, of course, is that question I mentioned earlier of compatibility, how far does the innovation fit into our world, can be explored through working with adopters. If we involve adopters and they can explain to us how their world works and what fits, that can shape our innovation so that it's more likely to be accepted because they feel they've had a part in shaping it. And the last set of factors in Rogers' model have to do with what he calls the environment. What sorts of things affect this innovation, communication, and decision process? And we can think of it. If the economics are very bad, we have no money in our pocket, we're unlikely to invest in something new. If we've got a lot of spare cash, well, maybe we'll try something out. If we think about that, we can begin to see how we might shape the environment in some way. If we want people to adopt electric cars, then perhaps give them some incentive to buy them, perhaps make it a little difficult to continue to own an old diesel car. Essentially, we can shape the environment which moves people towards adopting or not adopting something. If we're thinking about industry, the need to adopt pollution controls to stop all sorts of nasty emissions going up into the atmosphere, or these days lots of CO2 going up and contributing to global warming, well, we can do something about that. We can introduce policies, we can introduce penalties and sanctions. That will shape the way innovation works and certainly have an effect on adoption earlier or later. So we can play with the environment as the last thing that might influence this S-curve of adoption and diffusion. So let's summarize where we've been in this film. We need to understand adoption and diffusion. Why and when do innovations move to scale? We've looked at the Everett-Rogers model for diffusion of innovations, which is essentially a communication approach. And in the model, at the heart are four sets of influencing characteristics: the perceived characteristics of the innovation, the characteristics of the innovator, the one introducing the idea, the characteristics of the adopter, and the characteristics of the environment. Now, let's pause for a moment and think about all of that.